You know that person who doesn't cry? Not at funerals, not at the end of movies that broke everyone else in the room, not even when something happened to them that was, by any measure, genuinely devastating. The one who sat dry-eyed while others fell apart, and then probably wondered, quietly and alone, what was wrong with them. That person isn't heartless, they're not in denial, and they're definitely not stronger than everyone else, no matter how many times people have said that to them like it was a compliment. There's something far more layered happening beneath that dry-eyed stillness than most people ever think to ask about. If you're someone who doesn't cry, or can't, no matter how much part of you wants to, welcome. Today, we're getting into the psychology of people who don't cry. The ones society calls tough, stoic, composed. But science calls something else entirely. The inability to cry isn't a sign of emotional strength. It isn't indifference. It isn't even, in most cases, a choice. The world has been reading you wrong for a very long time. When someone stays dry-eyed through something painful, the assumption is always the same. They didn't feel it. But people who don't cry often feel everything. They feel it with a fullness and an intensity that has nowhere to go. The grief is there. The tenderness is there. The overwhelm is absolutely there. What's missing isn't the feeling. What's missing is the release. And those two things are not the same. Dr. Ad Vingerholtz has spent years studying why humans cry and why some of us don't. Crying is not simply an emotional response. It's a physiological one that depends on a specific chain of neurological events happening in a specific sequence. And in some people, that chain gets interrupted, not by choice, not by coldness, but by a nervous system that learned crying was not safe. Psychologists call it inhibited grieving, and it is far more common than anyone who hasn't experienced it will understand. You weren't born unable to cry. No one is. Crying is the first language, the most honest one. And then something teaches you what it costs. Maybe it was a home where tears were treated as weakness. Maybe you cried in front of someone who mattered and they used it against you. Maybe the environment was one where emotion was simply not done. Quietly but thoroughly discouraged. So you adapted. Not by stopping feeling, but by stopping the release of feeling. By learning to hold it at the top of the throat and keep it there, until holding it became automatic. The body remembers what the mind eventually forgets. There's a concept in psychology called alexithymia, a difficulty identifying and describing emotional states. Not the absence of emotion, the absence of access to it. People with alexithymic traits feel things, but those feelings exist somewhere beneath language, beneath recognition. Crying is the end of the arc, the release valve. When the arc can't complete, the valve never opens. This is not a flaw. This is a nervous system doing exactly what it learned to do. The feeling doesn't disappear just because the tears don't come. It has to go somewhere. In people who can't cry, it tends to go inward, where it calcifies quietly over time into something the body carries. Tears, particularly emotional tears, contain stress hormones, cortisol, leucine, and kephalin. The act of crying is, in a very literal sense, the body releasing chemistry that would otherwise remain in the system. When that release doesn't happen, those hormones don't simply disappear. They stay. They accumulate. This is why people who can't cry often describe feeling full, pressed, like something is always sitting just below the surface. Not because they're cold, because they're carrying something with no way to put it down. The thing that would help most, crying, is often the thing that feels most impossible. The same nervous system that learned crying wasn't safe is still running the calculation every time something hurts. Hold it. Don't. Not here. Not now. Not ever. That's not a decision. That's a deeply embedded protection. One that served you once and now costs you more than it gives. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with not being able to cry. It's the loneliness of not being able to access your own grief, of standing at the edge of something that should break you open and finding the door locked from the inside. of watching other people release what you're holding and feeling a strange, specific envy. That envy is not weakness. That envy is your system recognizing what it needs and not being able to reach it. The world has a way of deciding what grief looks like. And when your grief doesn't look like that, people misread you. They decide you're not affected. They give you less space to grieve because you look like you don't need it. They call you strong when what you are is simply private about your pain. And that misreading compounds the original wound because now you're not just carrying the thing, you're carrying it alone. You're not fine, you're full. Not crying does not mean not feeling. It does not mean not grieving. It means your nervous system found a different container for what it couldn't release. And that container has been doing quiet, exhausting, invisible work for a very long time. Healing doesn't look like forcing tears. Real healing for people who don't cry tends to be slower and more internal. It's learning to name what's there, to put language on the feeling that lives below language, to sit with the sensation in the chest, the heaviness, the pressure, the fullness, and let it exist without immediately managing it. The block isn't cognitive, it's somatic. It lives in the nervous system, not in the narrative. Approaches like somatic experiencing, EMDR, these create conditions where the arc can finally, slowly complete. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the tears come. Not dramatically, not in a flood, just quietly, unexpectedly, in a moment when the nervous system finally decides it might be safe. The tears that finally come for people who couldn't cry are rarely about what's in front of them. They're about everything the small thing finally gave permission to. Everything that was carried. You are not broken. You are not cold. You are not too strong to feel or too damaged to heal. You are someone whose system found a way to survive what it couldn't release. The survival was real, and it mattered, and it got you here. But survival doesn't have to be the whole story. The door that closed to protect you can learn slowly to open. Not all the way, not all at once, but enough. Enough to let some of what you've been carrying move through. That's not weakness finally winning. That's something in you deciding it might be safe enough to rest. And honestly, the fact that you're here, trying to understand what lies beneath your stillness, means the door is already just slightly ajar. If this felt like someone finally named something you've been carrying without words, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.